Welcome to Lecture 20. This is going to be a lecture about the making of the origin of species. I'm referring here, of course, to the book written by Charles Darwin and published in 1859. What we want to do today is to examine how Darwin came to write the book, and naturally, what was in it. It's a famous work, to be sure. Almost everyone has heard of it in one way or another, so it's appropriate that we take some time with it. It's had a profound effect on Western civilization, far greater than Darwin or anybody else at the time ever dreamed it would. Why is this? We're going to want to find that out. I'll tell you in a few minutes how this book was actually rushed into print. Darwin hadn't intended to publish it when he did. He felt forced into it. Part of the reason for this was because of the atmosphere in England in the 1850s. And a considerable reason that the atmosphere was charged was the increased attention that natural science was receiving. It was a matter of getting your ideas out there. We discussed last time how preoccupied early Victorian Britain became with the demands of natural science in the 1840s. Science was coming more and more to stand for the rule of law in the minds of many. I only described one major focus, the sensation surrounding the anonymous publication of Robert Chambers's book on the vestiges of the natural history of creation. There were other things as well. The largest telescope in the world was finally ready to go into operation in 1845, and you can bet that one of the first things to be done was to use it to test the nebular hypothesis that Chambers had pushed in his book. And then there was the famous discovery of a new planet in 1846. That got a lot of press because it raised the issue of who had the better science, France or England. We'll look at both of these celebrated events in Lecture 33. And there were plenty of other things going on in natural science as well. So there were lots of reasons why science was front and center in the 1840s and on into the 1850s. And the celebration of the rule of law in nature was not the prerogative of just one understanding of natural science either. I mentioned that proponents of phrenology and mesmerism saw themselves as defending the same claim that Robert Chambers supported in his references to astronomy and geology, and especially evolutionary biology. But of course, Chambers, and phrenology and mesmerism for that matter, were highly contested issues among various members of Victorian society. And that made the status and significance of natural science a contested affair as well. So it was an interesting time. Now, Charles Darwin was caught right in the middle of all of this. And as you can imagine, he experienced it with mixed emotions. He realized that he agreed with Chambers in one very fundamental respect. Life had evolved from primitive beginnings into the diversity he saw all around him. But that gave him a big problem as well. Why? Because Chambers was so widely denounced. Established men of science wanted little to do with it. Pure speculation, presumptuous, uncritical, unjustified conclusions, unacceptable. And respectable members of the church denounced it with equal vehemence. Superficial, no appreciation of God's role in nature and history, misunderstanding of the essentials of the religious faith, no respect for the meaning of Scripture, unacceptable. It seemed that the only people who embraced it were not the kind that Darwin wanted to be associated with. The leading representatives of natural science and religion were dead set against the work because of its endorsement of evolution. Darwin was caught right in the middle. So let's take a look at how Darwin fared after returning from the voyage of the HMS Beagle. He'd come to the conclusion relatively soon after his return that there was something to transmutation, as he called evolution. That, it turned out, was just the beginning. As he continued to work, he began to realize that his new outlook held many implications. He was going to have to think through all this. I mentioned in Lecture 18, when we examined his trip around the world, that Darwin came to a new idea, natural selection, as he began to explore what the notion of transmutation held in store for him. This was, in fact, a key insight. It meant that there was more to be said than just life has evolved. His grandfather had said that much, but as an aspiring young natural philosopher, that was nowhere near enough for Darwin. Lamarck had said more. He'd said how things evolved. But Darwin, having read Lyell's criticisms, didn't think much of Lamarck's mechanism for evolutionary change. Lyell made it clear that Lamarck didn't have any convincing empirical support for his theory. He didn't do much with fossil evidence at all. So he really wasn't able to demonstrate the historical progression of species that he assumed so easily. And what about humans? Are they simply animals like other species? Don't we have to make some exceptions where humans are concerned? That was Lyell's position. So none of the options available to Darwin in the late 1830s helped him overcome the natural reluctance he had regarding the idea of evolution. None, that is, until he came up with a new idea, natural selection. That gave Darwin, as he put it, a theory by which to work. He saw it as something solid, something that put meat on the skeleton of evolutionary theory. He tells us in his autobiography that it was from reading an essay by Thomas Malthus that the idea came to him. That was in the fall of 1838. He'd been working on transmutation for a little over a year. As part of his leisure reading, he'd picked up Malthus's essay on population. Now, Darwin knew Malthus's argument from his reading while a student at Cambridge. Malthus said that the rate human population increased was greater, in fact, qualitatively greater, than the rate agricultural food production increased. But, Malthus concluded, most of the time there has been a general balance between the population and food supply. So something must be curbing the rate of increase in the population. It was like an invitation to Darwin to come up with that something. Of course, he hadn't been thinking primarily about humans and their problems. He'd been thinking about all plant and animal life. But the basic principle was still applicable. There was more population than the food supply could sustain. What checked the population? I want you to listen to the words Darwin wrote into his notebook at the time. One may say, Darwin observed, that there is a force like 100,000 wedges trying to force every kind of adapted structure into the gaps in the economy of nature, or rather, forming gaps by thrusting out weaker ones. This was what he'd been missing, something that might act as a force for change, something that would force adaptation. It must have been an exciting moment. You know, the kind of moment when you suddenly realize that you've stumbled onto something. Oh, sure, you have very little idea how it's all going to work out, but you're pretty convinced that you can make it work. And now you want to get to it. But how did natural selection work? Darwin began to envision that the excess population was checked naturally. That is, the organisms that were eliminated were the ones that were less well adapted. Logically, if some were being removed, they were the most likely candidates. And that meant that the ones that survived did so because they were well adapted. Okay, so far so obvious. Well, what if the environment in which a species found itself changed? Maybe some environmental change, or maybe the species got moved to a new environment somehow. That would raise questions about which members of the species were most well adapted. It might be that what had been a well-adapted set of characteristics would no longer be as adaptive. Maybe other members of the species would be better adapted in the new environmental situation. If so, they would be the ones to survive. And whatever their characteristics were, they would be the ones most represented in the population. So over time, the general population would begin to show these characteristics more than the ones that used to predominate. Darwin allowed himself to think that the kind of change this process of natural selection might produce could even challenge the old idea of the fixity of species. Maybe this was a way that species could be made to change. Maybe species were mutable. Well, Darwin now had an agenda. I don't want to give you the impression that this moment of insight was what determined Darwin to choose the career path he now began to follow. There were lots of reasons why he'd abandoned the idea of going into the ministry. And he was 30 years old, time to think of settling down. In fact, he decided to marry a cousin, Emma Wedgwood, and pursue a life of research and publication. But that wasn't the comfortable and easy life you might think it should have been. Darwin was in fact under a lot of pressure. One thing that began to gnaw away at him was the realization that his theory might well be incompatible with his new wife's Anglican religion. Darwin himself had never been particularly religious or irreligious. He'd worried a bit about that when he'd considered going into the ministry. But he'd been genuinely impressed with some of the religious works he'd read, and his general lack of religious fervor hadn't been enough of a stumbling block to rule the ministry out as an option. And even now, after he'd realized that he didn't really want to pursue that career, he wasn't sure of his own thoughts about religion. But he certainly respected the religious views of others, especially those dear to him. So this was going to be a problem. But there were other pressures as well in these post-voyage years. He was in great demand to contribute articles for periodicals. Plus, he was writing up his Journal of Researches and his book on coral reefs. And of course, he couldn't stay away from working on his new theory. He wrote out 2 sketches of it, one in 1842, and a second, longer one in 1844 that ran to some 230 pages. All these things, and the pace at which he pursued his numerous writings, took its toll. Darwin dropped from 166 pounds to 148. So you can see the pressure he was under. And he also experienced the first episodes of an illness that would stay with him. It showed itself in prolonged spats of vomiting, and it would plague him his whole life. What it was is hard to say. There are several theories. Was it something he'd picked up in the tropics? Or was it simply his body telling him that the pressures were too great? Did he know deep in his stomach that what he was suggesting in his new theory might disturb far more people than just his bride? Was he aware at some level that he was in fact playing with some kind of fundamental fire? That'll all have to remain speculation. We know that he did finally begin by small degrees to let others in on what he was thinking. He told the geologist Charles Lyell that he'd been considering the possibility that species were mutable. Then, rather apologetically, he shared his views at the beginning of 1844 with a young botanist named Joseph Hooker. Hooker was just back from a voyage of his own. Darwin unintentionally lets us in on how he thought of this, about revealing his ideas to others, I mean. It was, he said, like confessing a murder. That's pretty strong stuff. But it gives you an idea of the state of Darwin's mind. Oh, he was quick to emphasize that this wasn't just the regurgitation of old ideas. He assured Hooker that the means by which he thought evolution occurred were totally different from Lamarck's. Of course, Hooker wanted to learn more. And then it happened. The vestiges came out, caused a sensation. The outcry against it must have really created a pit in Darwin's stomach. Anyway, he determined he was going to have to do a lot more work on his theory before he could ever dream of making it public. So Darwin abandoned writing up his species book. He was determined not to make the mistake Lyell had seen in Lamarck, no empirical evidence for his conclusions. But what kind of evidence was required? Darwin threw himself into close empirical observations of all kinds. He frequented garden clubs, he became a pigeon fancier, he talked to breeders, and he devoted himself to becoming an expert on a very particular kind of organism, barnacles. He was so preoccupied with barnacles that his children assumed it must be something that all grown-ups did. "Where does your father do his barnacles?" one of them asked his playmate. Well, Darwin's study of barnacles paid off big time. First, it resulted in 2 volumes on the subject in the early 1850s, making Darwin the world's authority. But it also produced a startling observation that reinforced in Darwin's mind that he was on the right track with his commitment to evolution. Most barnacles are hermaphrodites. They have both male and female reproductive organs. But Darwin found some in which a separate male organism lived as a parasite inside the carapace of a female. And that wasn't the only arrangement he discovered. He found others that were hermaphrodites, but they also had a separate male organism, sometimes two extra males. What was going on here? What was nature doing? Darwin concluded that he was seeing evolution in action. It was an echo of the birth of sexuality itself. This hodgepodge of variations he found, hermaphrodites, separate sexes, hermaphrodites with one separate male organism, hermaphrodites with two males, might not this variety illustrate the gradual emergence of separate sexes from an original hermaphroditic ancestor? Suppose everything had been originally hermaphroditic, and then nature had stumbled onto sexuality. That would mean that the production of variation would have been enormously enhanced. Sexual reproduction, unlike asexual reproduction, introduced variety all the time, and variation was always good, at least where his theory was concerned. Why? Because the more variation there was, the more choices there would be from which nature could select. The haphazard origin of sex was beautifully consistent with natural selection. This was exciting. But as exciting as it was, the late 1840s and early 1850s were a trying time for Darwin personally. That sickness I told you about, he continued to suffer from it. His major symptoms were nausea, trembling, headaches, giddiness, and a loss of energy. And then his father died in November of 1848. That event was followed by a period of unusual illness, which, I suppose, lends some credence to the theory of a psychological origin of Darwin's illness. But there was an upside here. Darwin learned after his father died what his personal inheritance would be. He got over 50,000 pounds, a huge sum. Darwin would manage it well. He was a very good investor. From this point on, any doubt about his financial future was settled. He was guaranteed the life of a country gentleman. But that was one of the few bright spots of these years. His illness continued. He went to doctors. All medical treatments failed to help. And then in 1849, Darwin began taking the water cure. This was a regimen of cold showers and steam baths, and it seemed to work for him. But he wasn't the only one in the family who was not well. His oldest daughter, 10-year-old Annie, had also been sick for some time. In the spring of 1851, she became ill enough that Darwin decided to take her with him to receive the water cure. But a month later, Annie's condition worsened. And then the unthinkable happened. Charles was especially close to Annie, and when she died that spring, it hit him hard. He wasn't able to comprehend it within any of the traditional structures that Victorian society provided. His nominal religious stance just couldn't cut it. That had been decaying for some time now anyway. But Darwin later said that it was Annie's death that marked the final death knell for his Christianity. Of course, Emma used her faith to help her through the crisis, and Darwin continued to respect her for it. Well, he finally returned to the Species manuscript in 1856. All his empirical work had convinced him more than ever that his theory of natural selection was correct. So Darwin began preparing his friends. It was in April of 1856 that he invited several of them down to a place called Down, where he lived, his country residence 16 miles south of London, where he had gone to live in the country. Hooker came, of course. He was already aware of Darwin's ideas, but also present was the brash young marine scientist Thomas Huxley. The main subject of the discussion in this meeting was the possibility of transmutation. Some of those present allowed it might be possible, but others, especially Huxley, didn't like its progressive overtones. Huxley was one of those who felt that if nature was a machine, which he thought it was, that had any autonomy at all, then how could we know it would be disposed to produce progress as humans envisioned it? That smacked too much of religion for him, and this was science. Now, Darwin didn't tip his hand about natural selection here. He had told Lyell about it somewhat earlier. Natural selection impressed Lyell, but at the same time, that old objection he'd raised about Lamarck continued to bother him here as well. What troubled him was how Darwin's theory and natural selection in particular related to humans. It seemed to run roughshod right over the special qualities that humans possessed. In particular, it appeared to Lyell to reduce humans solely to animals, and that didn't respect the dignity of the species. Still, Lyell knew that Darwin was onto something. He urged Darwin to write up his ideas and get them into print. After all, Lyell said, you wouldn't want to be scooped by someone else. So in May of 1856, Darwin began writing up a sketch of the book about species. He decided against writing a preliminary essay. He would publish first and perfect the theory later. The title he decided on was simply Natural Selection. And then, on June 18th, 1858, his worst fears came true. Just what Lyell had warned him about. He got a letter from an English naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace, who was writing Darwin from the Malay archipelago. Wallace knew Darwin had traveled in the tropics too, and of course, Darwin had established himself as a leading naturalist in Britain with his many publications on technical matters. What Wallace wanted Darwin's opinion about was an idea that had come to him as a result of what he was seeing there in the Malay Islands. And that idea was, you guessed it, remarkably similar to Darwin's conception of natural selection. What to do? Darwin held all those good Victorian values of honesty and integrity and earnestness and the like. He wanted to do the right thing, but he'd been working on natural selection so long. It was Lyell and Hooker who came up with a suggestion. Have Wallace's letter and a short précis of Darwin's theory both read publicly. Present them to, say, the Linnaean Society's June meeting. And that's what happened. The two papers were read. Darwin himself wasn't present. And lo and behold, the papers produced no major reaction at all from the members. So Darwin had discharged his responsibility. He was now determined that he was free to publish the species manuscript he'd been working on. Of course, he rushed it into print in a shortened form from the one he'd planned. An abstract, he called it. But he freely confessed in the opening pages that he'd done this because of Wallace's letter. The book, it now had a new, more provocative title, appeared in November of 1859. Now you could see in the very title that Darwin was taking on a very old problem indeed. It was On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. What this natural selection was you couldn't tell until you looked into the text. But the origin of species, that was clear. Darwin, that eminently respected naturalist who traveled all around the world, Darwin was signing on to the idea that some species had originated naturally. That is, that they had come to be sometime since God's original creative decree. And from the tone of this natural selection phrase, you could guess that Darwin was saying God hadn't had a direct hand in it. Was Darwin endorsing Chambers? Well, you'll not be surprised to learn that by the time of its appearance, orders for the book had outstripped the first run. Everyone wanted to hear what Darwin had to say. And when they opened the book, they weren't disappointed. It was very interesting, to say the least. More. Readers were drawn along by an overall logic. Darwin moved from the variation that breeders of plants and animals were well known to be able to introduce to an inference that nature could do the same. That seemed straightforward enough. We should expect that breeders could only accomplish what nature would allow, so nature should be able to do what breeders could do. But wait a minute, Darwin was saying something more. He was suggesting, and here comes the rub, that because nature had enormous time at its disposal, nature could do what breeders couldn't. Even if we grant Darwin that nature has been around for eons of time, how did he justify the conclusion that nature could produce more change than breeders could? Enough change, for example, to alter an entire species over time. Breeders had never been able to do that. As readers plowed on through the book, they found themselves reminded of something that everyone was well aware of, the struggle for existence that goes on in nature. That needed no proof. The poet Tennyson had recently expressed this common knowledge in his phrase, "Nature red in tooth and claw." But then the reader came upon Darwin's idea of natural selection. Useful variations are inevitable in the thousands of generations that have existed, and when they occurred, the individuals bearing them would have the best chance at surviving and reproducing their kind. The opposite would be true for those with harmful variations, which were also inevitable. This preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of injurious variations, Darwin wrote, I call natural selection. Darwin then drew the net tighter. The continuous operation of natural selection over vast time had produced changes in species so substantial that they have been transmuted into different species. Possible? Maybe. And then Darwin was downright unfair. He made the book credible and persuasive by candidly admitting that there were some problems with his idea. Oh yes, he went on to try and solve them, but you got the sense that you were being dealt with fairly here. This was no dogmatic diatribe. And of course, the book was filled with specific information about plants and animals that illustrated his theory. Better not challenge Darwin there. He knows more about that kind of thing than anyone you could think of. Clearly, Darwin wanted to give the impression that his theory rested on facts. This was an impressive achievement. The reader knew there was something about this theory that marked it off from Chambers, but it might have taken a little thought to realize exactly what that was. Then it became clear. What made it different from Chambers's evolutionary scheme was that Chambers had emphasized the idea of evolution without specifying how it occurred, while Darwin focused on the mechanism of evolution, natural selection. But Lamarck had specified a mechanism too. Why was it different from Lamarck? That was a much harder question to sort out. In fact, Darwin himself had acknowledged a role for use and disuse, albeit a much less prominent one than Lamarck had. It was going to take some time to clarify the difference between Darwin and Lamarck. That was all ahead. We'll save that for another lecture. But the reception of the origin made it crystal clear what Darwin's achievement had been. The quality of the work was evident to most everyone. It was close reasoning about precise observations, and that was the mark of a good work of science at the time. Further, many of Darwin's friends praised the work highly in reviews and lectures. Of course, there were plenty who opposed it. Some objected that Darwin's inductive reasoning was too loose. The work didn't prove its case, they said. How could it? You couldn't run experiments to test natural selection. It had all happened in the remote past, so any reasoning about that would have to remain speculation. In the end, it remained for them an unsubstantiated hypothesis. But the greatest objection was that Darwin had viewed nature as something completely outside providence. This wasn't even deism of the usual sort. In deism, there was still providence. God accomplished his purpose by using natural law. But Darwin's natural selection didn't seem to require that there be a divine blueprint for creation and its development. It didn't seem to require any kind of a blueprint at all. Whatever variations happened along, regardless of where they came from, were just fine as far as the theory was concerned. They could even be produced by chance, and the theory worked the same way as it did if the new variations had been introduced by God. Chance as good as God? What kind of process was that? No wonder one prominent natural philosopher of the time said that in Darwin's theory, the law of higgledy-piggledy took the place of the divine superintendence of life. So Darwin had sharpened the issue of the relationship between natural science and religion by asserting that his scientific understanding of nature existed apart from the traditional religious view and even apart from the rich tradition of deism. This was radical stuff indeed. Darwin wasn't like Chambers in another way as well. He didn't attempt, as Chambers had, to support or justify his theory by associating it with a developmental cosmology. Darwin wanted to give the impression that he rested his case on specialized research, not on a philosophical disposition or religious leaning. That was what should drive the scientist: research. And whether or not Darwin's claim could stand up, it was the impression he cultivated quite successfully. The implication of Darwin's natural selection, especially when it was seen as the law of higgledy-piggledy, was enormously threatening to his age, and not just for the layperson. Many scientists as well could not permit natural science to escape so far away from the purpose that divine providence had supplied and the usual understanding of the history of the cosmos. But Darwin's argument was not without difficulties either. Darwin himself had conceded that the theory had problems. And in our next lecture, we'll look at the troubles with Darwin's theory that quickly came to the surface.